We have previously been discussing the Progressive Era, and you can't really talk about the Progressive Era without talking about good old Teddy Roosevelt, the first president of that era, probably the most prominent of the presidents in that era. We've talked about him once before in context of the Spanish-American War. Roosevelt, raised in a privileged New York family, police chief of New York City, later Undersecretary of the Navy, and then during the Spanish-American War, the leader of a volunteer regiment called the Rough Riders, who had a famous charge up San Juan Hill, even though the charge was actually made without horses, and with the assistance of the Buffalo Soldiers, the all-black unit, which sort of got lost in history at the time. Roosevelt came out of that war as a very famous person, which sat very well with him. As his daughter once said, he loved attention. He liked to be, as his daughter said, the bride at every wedding and the corpse at every funeral. Well, about a year after the end of the war, the sitting vice president, the vice president serving with President McKinley, died suddenly. McKinley was facing re-election in 1900, and he chose Teddy Roosevelt, who was extremely popular, as his running mate. McKinley, as we previously discussed, defeated William Jennings Bryan in the election and remained in the White House, although not for very long. He was assassinated not long after taking office in his second term. So, of course, his vice president, Teddy Roosevelt, was suddenly elevated to the presidency. You may have heard that John F. Kennedy was the youngest person ever to be elected president, and that is correct. However, he was not the youngest person to serve. Teddy Roosevelt was younger than Kennedy would be when he took office. He was 42 years old. He wasn't 42 when he was elected president. He had been elected vice president on the McKinley ticket. However you want to look at it, Roosevelt was the youngest president that had served up to that time, and actually the youngest who has served since. Some of the most notable things about Roosevelt's administration I have listed here. Roosevelt was a Republican, but in a lot of ways, his very progressive way of approaching governing came as a surprise, perhaps, to some of his constituents and supporters. Roosevelt called for what he referred to as the square deal. That is to say, if you're not familiar with that term, a fair deal. In essence, he wasn't saying that everyone had the right to succeed, but he was saying that in America, everyone should have the right not to have the deck stacked against them. Everyone should have an equal chance at success. You'll notice that I then have listed this law from 1890, 10 years, more than 10 years, before Roosevelt took office even as vice president. The Sherman Antitrust Act. A trust is the same thing as a monopoly. There had been a law on the books passed by Congress for over a decade making the formation of monopolies illegal. However, no one had ever enforced it. So this is one of the surprising things that Roosevelt did right off the bat. He started making it clear he was going to enforce this law and pass other similar laws to regulate business in various different ways. For example, the formation of the Food and Drug Act, which was a response really to the public outcry over what had been published in the novel The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, revealing the very unsanitary means by which meat was produced, the meatpacking plants. So now there is an agency run by the government that regulates and monitors places that produce food and drugs. Roosevelt was also very much a proponent of conservation, which was actually a fairly new phenomenon, fairly new idea at that time. It's important that you be aware that there's a difference between conservation conservationism, and preservationism, which was also a big thing in the late 1800s. Preservationism is the idea, supported by people like the naturalist John Muir, that wilderness areas need to be set aside and preserved exactly as they are and untouched. Conservation was a different approach, and we'll talk a little bit more in a moment about what that entailed. But safe to say that, at least this part of our conversation, Teddy Roosevelt was very, very strongly in favor of conservation. In 1905, he even got involved in college football. Now, college football is something that had really started in the 1880s or so, had become a big thing by the 1890s. And by the early 1900s, there was a formation that was used in which all the players locked hands, locked arms, basically formed like a phalanx, and were unstoppable players on the offense. Those who were trying to defend their side, their goal, and trying to keep the offense from advancing, had no chance of stopping this formation, the flying wedge. Not only could they not stop it, but they were frequently being trampled, and sometimes people were being killed. Roosevelt was concerned about this. His son was actually playing college football at the time. And he sent a message to the various colleges saying, you need to come up with some way to regulate this game of football, or else the government is going to step in and do it for you, which eventually led to the National College Athletics Association, NCAA. So that's the extent to which Roosevelt was invested in interceding and in government regulation of things. He came to be known as the Great Trust Buster. Again, a trust being a monopoly. Roosevelt divided corporations into good corporations and bad corporations. These were his terms. In his terms, a good corporation is one that serves the public interest, and a bad one is one that is run by greedy financiers who are only concerned with profit and are not concerned at all with the public interest. And in his opinion, that sort of corporation had no right to exist. 1904, the government interceded with J.P. Morgan's Northern Securities Company, which had a monopoly pretty much on finance, and dissolved that company. So Roosevelt was serious about this. He invented a term that is still used today in politics, the bully pulpit. Bully was a slang term of the time that meant something is good. It's kind of like saying something is cool. Roosevelt used the expression a lot. So by bully, in this sense, it's something really great, right? He was saying that the White House is like a pulpit, a church pulpit, a bully one, a really great one. In other words, if you have the office of president, you have a huge advantage in trying to get through the things that you want to accomplish over people who would like to prevent you from accomplishing those things, because you have the office of the presidency, you have the gravitas, the authority that goes along with it, and he recommended highly you should use it every chance you got. Use your position as president to get the things done that you want to get done. Progressives in general during this era, and Roosevelt administration certainly fell under this, had several things that kind of defined their movement. They placed a lot of importance on experts. They placed a lot of importance on the public good. They sought to restrain what Roosevelt called special interests, a term that is still used today, basically meaning any group whose concern is not the general welfare of the country, but their specific interests. This could mean various different things today, But when Roosevelt used this term, he was specifically talking about financial interests, businesses who were trying to basically promote the things that were good for them and never mind the rest of the country. Progressives also believed in an activist state, that is, the government not just standing aside and letting things happen, but the government getting actively involved in trying to shape policy and in trying to promote the general welfare in every way that they could.